Good morning, everyone. So every few years, I go through an experience that feels so rooted in a certain time and place that it kind of reminds me I'm an accident of history, a product of India's independence and of partition, of the Stonewall riots and September's children, of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, but most importantly, of the Hot Topic mall scene of the late 2000s. I am the child of my mother and my father, but I'm also the child of everything that allowed their stories to be. And I know that I'm so far from who they imagined I would be when they first chose to start a family thousands of miles from their birthplaces. They could not have foreseen a 16-year-old crowd surfing to pummeling drums at the Vans Warped Tour. Nor could they have foreseen the drag shows I make a regular part of my life. But this, delivering a sermon to a Christian church in downtown Seattle, I think that's probably the furthest from what they imagined. So if I'm being honest, writing this sermon was a little bit of a struggle, and I've gained a renowned, a deep, profound respect for what our reverends do on a weekly basis. I knew what I wanted to talk about, but I didn't quite know how. I wanted to talk about the challenges that I've been grappling with these past few years and the ways that I have been wrestling with my own upbringing. I wanted to discuss the difficulty I've had reconciling the love that has filled my life with all the imperfect forms that love has taken. I wanted to talk about how difficult it has been to come to terms with my life and what it looks like when so much of it was shaped by a force bent on suppressing important parts of who I am and how I present myself. In short, I wanted to talk about the cracks in the foundation upon which my life and all of our lives have been built, and whether a structural overhaul was even possible. These concerns had very real ramifications. 2 years ago at 24, I was halfway through medical school and more aware than ever that a big reason I had chosen this path was to atone and compensate for not being straight. On top of that, I knew more than anybody else that my eating and fitness habits came from chasing an ideal of beauty that by definition I would never achieve. What would it look like if I was able to pull away from this toxicity, and if I could even do so after it had shaped my life and my career in such fundamental ways? I played with metaphors to try and convey this. The idea of accidentally throwing out the baby with the bathwater implied a discrete separation of the good and the painful that I don't think is there. While metaphors of surgery or metastatic cancer felt appropriate to discuss broader social forces, it felt like a deep disservice to my family to describe them in those terms, especially when they raised me with such love in their hearts. I could not, in good conscience, discuss them like that. My family is, in its own way, idyllic, and I want to make that very clear. They're a snapshot of the most peaceful moments you see in Jhumpa Lahiri's short stories. A family that found a way to thrive in a country that wasn't theirs and that built a community of co-ethnics around them, points of reference and contact in a land that did not always understand them. As imperfect as I sometimes describe them to be, it was beautiful and it is beautiful. Reflecting upon all of this in preparation for today also sent me backwards into the scriptures that I was told as a child and into the story I'll be discussing today. The metaphor in here feels more proactive and forward-looking than some of the metaphors that I played with. It is a story about Lord Shiva from the Bhagavata Purana, one of the more influential and widely represented Hindu texts. I should note here that the text we're using is not a translation from the Purana itself, but rather an adaptation designed for an educational website. The Devas and the Asuras were cousins who were always at war. Once there came a time when the cousins agreed to stop fighting and to work together. The idea was to churn the ocean of milk, which would yield Amrit, or the nectar of immortality. Anyone who had a sip of Amrit would live forever. The cousins, the Devas and the Asuras, both wanted to become immortals. So putting aside their differences, they agreed to churn the ocean of milk. They placed Mandara, a large mountain, on the ocean bed. The mountain was to be used as a rod to churn Amrit out of the ocean. Lord Vishnu took the form of a giant tortoise to support Mount Mandara on the ocean bed and to prevent it from sinking. The serpent king Vasuki allowed the cousins to use him as the rope to rotate the huge churning rod. The serpent was looped around Mount Mandara. Vasuki's tail was held by the Devas, and his head was held by the Asuras. Using all their might, the cousins began to churn the ocean of milk. To their dismay, as the ocean of milk was churned hard, it threw up a cloud of deadly poison, hala hala. This poisonous gas choked the devas and the asuras. But before it could inflict severe damage, Shiva scooped it up in his hand and swallowed it. His wife, Parvati, was quick to grasp Shiva's neck tightly to prevent the poison from going down into his throat. As a result, Shiva got a blue patch on his neck that is seen in many pictorial depictions of him. For this trait, he is sometimes known as Nilkant, which is Sanskrit for blue throat. There are different tellings of this story. In fact, I had not read this version, the most commonly accepted one, until I was researching it for this sermon. In the story I was raised on, there is no mention of Parvati clamping down on Shiva's throat so that the poison he has swallowed cannot drip into his stomach and poison him from within. Rather, the blue comes from the poison in itself, an outward depiction of what Shiva is holding. Other tellings of the story clarify that Vasuki, the snake who allows himself to be used as a churning rod, takes his place around Shiva's neck to ensure that the poison remains there. When I was told the story as a child, it was as an example of the great Shivaji's sacrifice and of his humility, of all he does without expecting anything in return, to believe in a love so pure and so uncorrupted by expectation and brokenness that they would be willing to hold the poisons that corrupt our lives. That is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's also a belief that I'm not capable of having. I should admit here that I don't believe in God. I don't believe there's anybody out there who will hold this poison in their throat for us. I don't believe in Shiva or Vishnu, and I don't accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God. I don't say this as a criticism of those who do hold that faith, but rather as an acknowledgement of where I'm coming from when I tell you this. Though I don't believe in God, I do believe in the power of these words and of this story and what it can tell us. When I read about the nectar of immortality, I don't read it as a literal freedom from death. Instead, I understand it as liberation from a dark force that hovers over our heads and that permeates our existence and everything that we do. I understand the work of churning, of separating the nectar from the poison, as work we must all undertake to experience that liberation. It's not work we need to undertake alone. Like the gods coming together with the Serpent King to assist the devas and the asuras, this is work we can do as a community. And that final step of finding a place to hold the poison so that it does not corrupt us, and so that we may revel in all the joy that the nectar has to offer, that may be the hardest and most isolating work of it all. That Parvati and Vasuki help Shiva hold the poison in his throat says something about the love and support we can find in our relationships. A reminder that while it is ultimately our responsibility to hold the poison in our throat, that work need not be undertaken alone. The story stood out to me because we are swimming in a poisoned ocean, and every day we are drinking in the world around us. The air that we breathe and the land upon which we stand has been corrupted to its very core. At my parents' home in northern New Jersey, the land was walked by the Lenape before it was walked by slaves. And today the town boundaries, including the middle-class suburb in which I was raised, have been shaped by the legacies of redlining and white flight. When I first moved to the West Coast, I traveled up from Los Angeles through San Francisco before I arrived in Seattle. And it was hard to shake the feeling of what had happened there 77 years ago. In the streets outside of this church and across this city, Japanese Americans were taken from their homes as their white neighbors stood idly by, or if I know this region at all, avoiding eye contact altogether. And I live in a Capitol Hill that is no longer gentrifying, but is gentrified. And it is hard to hold the joy I find in some of the spaces in that neighborhood, knowing what was taken away so that it could exist. I know these poisons I just named are broad, sweeping, and systemic, but they manifest in individuals through their behavior and how they treat others. We are swimming in an ocean of milk, and the poison within it has infiltrated all of us. It's what makes it so challenging to hold the bounty of love I was given as a child by my parents and the community that they built for themselves. And I mean a neighborhood that looked out for each other, that invited the neighbors' children over for dinner, that collected each other's mail when folks went on vacation, and that sent over leftovers when they made too much of that dish that they were known for. When it is so intertwined with their own unique wariness of difference, and of a queer phobia that forced me to try and mold myself into someone I could never fully be. It's a question many of my friends have also been confronting in the past few years. How do they reconcile their love and affection for their families, their parents and their grandparents, and the people they grew up with the knowledge that these folks who nurtured them and shaped them voted for a xenophobe for xenophobic reasons? How do you stay in a relationship with people you love, knowing that the hurt they carry out on both individual and systemic levels? More personally, How do we hold the hurt that we have caused? And how do we reconcile that with what I think we all believe, that we are fundamentally good people? How do I, as a queer person and as a non-binary person, hold and reconcile the homophobia and transphobia I've internalized and perpetuated with the glory that I've found in my own queer liberation? How do I, as someone who lives with depression and anxiety, hold the hurt that I've inflicted when my internal monologue is at its worst? I feel the metaphor of keeping this poison trapped in our throat so it does not soak through and corrupt us. It is apt because I do not think this poison that we never asked to ingest, ever fully goes away. But to control it, to keep yourself from becoming nothing but it, is possible. However, this is not a passive process. It requires energy, and it's the work that we, living in this world, have been tasked with, as both individuals and as a community, to separate the nectar of immortality and of liberation from the poison that it is inextricably intertwined with. To be honest, I worry a little about this reading of the story. I worry it can be weaponized against marginalized groups to tell them to focus on the nectar and to hold their own poison. I worry it can be used against folks who struggle, like I do, with their internal monologues. To look at this work of separating the poison from the nectar as purely internal is a mistake. We need to understand it in the context of the world in which we live. But what does that look like in practice? How can we churn the ocean in which we live? We do not need a mountain or the king of serpents or a giant tortoise to do this work. No, instead we need compassion, empathy, and processes of restorative justice. We need to develop a toolkit that limits the amount of poison in this world and that centers what our world can look like when we all bring forth what we can offer and what we carry within us. We all carry that nectar within us, and I do not want us to forget that. It's why I chose to title this sermon, The Nectar Within Us, instead of The Poison That Can Consume Us. That poison is there, and we need to confront it. But it does not need to define us, because while that poison sits in our throat, that nectar flows through our veins and rushes in and out of our beating hearts. It is this nectar that can nourish us and tell us everything that we can be and more. Acknowledging and holding the poison in this world and within us is absolutely difficult work, but it allows us to fully engage with how much beauty and how much love is out there. I can't tell you what exactly that nectar looks like for you or what it looks like for different communities, because that freedom and that liberation is unique to every person. But I can tell you where I have found it. I found that nectar the first time I hung a long shimmering piece of jewelry from my ear. It resembled a small golden sword. And while I never felt more vulnerable or more visible wearing it through Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square, I also never felt more powerful. At home in my own skin and what I could adorn it with. This earring not just a decoration, but also a weapon that empowered me and emboldened me. I felt it last November when a stranger, right here at this church at an Undoing Institutional Racism workshop, invited me to her and her partner's house for their queer Diwali party. Diwali is the Hindu festival of lights, and I arrived to a beautifully adorned, colorful home in Mount Baker, filled with genderqueer folks wearing the traditional clothing that affirmed them, laughing and dancing to the Bollywood hits from the early 2000s, songs so cheesy that they put musical theater to shame, and songs so campy they belonged at this year's Met Gala. I felt it on a quiet Sunday morning this past March, sitting on my bench in the backyard of the Justice Leadership Program's house. There was some mist beneath the sunlight, and my backyard was littered with the powdered remnants of the queer holy party I had thrown the day before, my own reclamation and version of a favorite childhood holiday. I felt it in the I love you text my mother sent me after she and my father watched Love, Simon in theaters. And I absolutely feel it in the image I have of them, two middle-aged South Asian folks sitting in a theater crowded with middle schoolers and high schoolers, oohing and awing every turn that rom-com takes. I see glimmers of it every Sunday right here in this church, in a community that looks so little like the version of Christianity that I grew up seeing in American politics, and that wants to do right by the community in which it lives. And these moments seem small, I know, and the amount of poison in this world seems daunting. But the work of holding and acknowledging all the poison within me, poison that none of us asked for, and extracting it from the beauty of where I come from and the resplendence of who I am, that is what it must have felt like for the Devas and Asuras to drink that nectar of immortality and liberation. Thank you.